on the horizon. My subject is film and television. And the title of my paper is actually Not a Pretty Picture, Film and Television After 9/11. And I preface it with these lines from a poem by Sir Philip Sidney, Astrophil and Stella, who was a very famous courtier poet. I will use the remnant of my wit to convince myself that all is well, while with a feeling skill I paint my hell. Unquote. The HBO television movie Path to Paradise, the untold story of the World Trade Center bombing, 1997, documented the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and demonstrates exactly how easy it was for bombers to gain access to the building. Near the film's end, when the bombing is proved less than catastrophic, a frustrated terrorist utters as he looks down at the World Trade Center towers, "Next time, we'll bring them both down." The film makes clear that the terrorist battle for the world's attention is far from over, and the repeat assaults in the Twin Towers can be counted on as a natural consequence of world events. Indeed, this is just what happened, and here it seems the commercial art prefigured the events of 9/11. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the number of forthcoming terrorist dramas had to be shelved or re-edited. They were now inappropriate, including Collateral Damage 2002, which was an Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle. Deadline, a hijacked film written for director James Cameron that never made it past the script stage. World War III, a proposed Jerry Bruckheimer film in which terrorist invaders drop nuclear bombs simultaneously on Seattle and San Diego. Big Trouble, a Tim Allen comedy centered on a bomb on a passenger jet that goes off. And Nosebleed, a Jackie Chan comedy in which the veteran action star would have stopped a terrorist plot to blow up the World Trade Center. These were all in progress just as the events of 9/11 happened. But at least one Hollywood veteran saw all of this as nothing more than less than a prophecy fulfilled. The late, great Robert Altman told the Associated Press in an interview shortly after 9/11 that movies such as the ones discussed in the preceding lines, quote, set the pattern, and these people have copied the movies. Nobody would have thought to commit an atrocity like this unless they'd seen it in a movie. I just believe we created this atmosphere and taught them how to do it, unquote. Not surprisingly, once the images of the September 11 disaster were an accomplished fact, duly videotaped from a variety of angles by both professional and amateur video recorders, they became fair game for a new series of pornographic disaster videos, not unlike the notorious Faces of Death series. CNN, CNBC, Faux News, and other U.S. news outlets broadcast and rebroadcast the images of the Twin Towers being hit over and over again like a porno loop. But in China, enterprising entrepreneurs went one step further, creating such instant DVD disaster movies as The Century's Great Catastrophe, Surprise Attack on America, and America's Disaster, the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. These hybrid productions, freely mixing pirated news footage with equally illegal clips from conventional Hollywood disaster movies, began appearing fewer than 72 hours after the World Trade Center collapse on the streets of New York sold as pirate DVDs. After the end of the Second World War, but before the turn of the 21st century, the arts before 9/11 dealt with many issues: birth, life, death, capitalism, love, nature, and celebrated the act of creation with an almost hedonistic abandon. Above all, the arts celebrated life. But in the years following 9/11, the arts have been transformed into a mirror, I would argue, of the fear, death, paranoia, and uncertainty that now pervades American existence. The disaster of the Twin Towers has transformed the cultural landscape profoundly, inescapably, and forever. It's one of those defining moments in which a culture is shaped anew by the social events that impact it. Fear, death, and paranoia are the new social currency. What is celebrated now is not art, it's artifice. Our culture surrounds itself with totemic images of destruction, from everything to such television series as Life After People, which predicts what will happen in a post-apocalyptic future, to films like In Time, in which life expectancy is a commodity to be bought and sold, and the rich have all the cards, including potential immortality. New York, arguably the artistic hub of the United States, and that's incidentally my hometown, has become a museum of itself, seeking to recreate the past by selling off the totemic paintings and sculptures and other artworks of the pre-9/11 era for outrageous prices to the stratospherically rich. The emptiness of every aspect of post-9/11 art, except where it deals with themes of pain, destruction, and violence, is everywhere apparent. Pop music has been transformed from an agent for change into mindless escapism, even as the digitization of culture wipes out record stores, bookstores, and video stores. As text, music, and images become streamed like utilities, available for a price, stored in the cloud, accessed only by a continual outlay of cash by the consumer. And the physicality of art has vanished. No more books, no more CDs, no more DVDs, no more movies. All is streaming. It's all disposable, can be turned on and off like water or any other utility. You don't really own it. It sits in the cloud, but you can access it for a price. Music, book, movies, they've all gone streaming and past the tipping point of being a fringe market. It's the market. It's easy to access, requires no storage space. You can store your books, movies, and music in clouds, and that's all there is to it. As one proof of this, illegally streaming movies has recently become a felony. This also demonstrates, to me at least, that streaming is now the dominant technology and corporations are taking notice. It's where the money is. But the question of all this for me is this: what do you really own? An essential component, at least to me, in any purchase is possession of the physical entity itself. Of course, the concept is old-fashioned to most. You simply watch movies on your iPad, listen to movies on your iPod, read books on your Kindle or Nook. You stream. But what do you really own? The answer is that no one really owns anything anymore. The real is being replaced by the virtual. Art has become corporatized at every level. The idea of a local artist breaking through to a national level has now become a measure of the artist's marketability rather than that person's talent. The economic collapse of 2008 has further stratified American society and society worldwide into the very, very poor and the very, very rich, with the middle class being squeezed out of existence. With rents and prices for studio space in major metropolises rising out of all control, the only art created now is institutional art, designed to offend as few people as possible, while at the same time aiming at the widest possible lowest common denominator audience. The more original, authentic arts are being attacked vigorously, as our first speaker noted, by the ruling classes throughout the world because they are dangerous. They offer a voice to the individual in a society that now seeks to rule by forced consensus. This is part of the conglomerization of arts to become more of a corporate commodity, a trophy, rather than something that an individual creates. More than ever, it seems that the best artist is a dead artist, because there's a limited supply of his or her work, which can be sold as a commodity, and the best celebrity spokespersons are also corpses, because the iconic images of Kerouac, Bogart, Hepburn, and Taylor, just to name a few, can be used to sell anything, without the slightest risk of possible future scandal or any unflattering headline. All their future is in the past, and thus it can be recycled, packaged, and used to sell new goods to those too young to remember the world the way it was. Spectacle, which has been discussed here today, as in films such as 300, has replaced content. Action has replaced thought. Music cues tell you how to feel, when to feel sad, when to rejoice. Everything is laid out in a clear, schematic design. The films of the 21st century are designed because of their ever-increasing cost for mass audiences and can afford to leave no one behind. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which I am in deep sympathy with, continually pounds home this simple theme, and yet those in power pretend to be mystified by the movement's guiding principle. The rich are getting rich, much richer, as seen in the superb film Margin Call, which I hope you've all seen, which effectively depicts the 2008 market meltdown starting at Lehman Brothers with unsparing accuracy. The semi-fictitious financial firm in Margin Call suddenly discovers that it's deeply overextended in mortgage derivatives and sells off 93% of their position in a single day to avoid the company's collapse, but at the expense of all who will buy the worthless equities the company offers. Meanwhile, the top executives of the company, one who was played with brilliant sardonicism by Jeremy Irons, walk off with multiple millions in bonuses, while those directly beneath him stay in their offices doing nothing, collecting massive paychecks for simply staying off the street with the bad news. The traders, meanwhile, at the lowest level of the company, sell off the bad debts and then are summarily fired. The whole scenario was all too true. I should say parenthetically, I have a former student of mine who worked at Lehman Brothers during this period in a very high-level position and wrote me basically saying, this nails it completely, see this film immediately. Right? The traders, meanwhile, lost some companies sold them and they were immediately fired. The whole scenario is all too true. In the 21st century, money rules and everything else, all human communication, art or interpersonal bonds, are entirely expendable. Criticism has all but vanished in the wake of the web, and with everyone now qualifying her and himself as a cultural authority, any real value to the critical act has all but vanished. Damien Hirst makes art out of consumption with a series of diamond-studded skulls and other totemic icons of consumerism. Films such as The Hurt Locker, Melancholia, and Margin Call, which deal honestly and forthrightly with the vicissitudes of our current existence, language on the commercial sidelines. They open in selected cities, read New York, Los Angeles, that's it. While escapist fares such as Avatar, which encourages audiences to believe that they can abandon their damaged bodies and escape into a new virtual world, rack up mind-boggling grosses because they offer mindless escape. Captain America, First Avenger, is in many ways the perfect prototype of the new millennial film. Set in World War II, but concluding in the present, it offers Nazis as conveniently circumscribed villains and deals resolutely in the past, but at the same time, it depicts a society relentlessly as war, much as we were until recently in Iraq. Thus, it asks audience to participate in a wartime social environment with this added bonus. It's a war that the West decisively won. This time around, the lines are much more blurred. I call Iraq the silent war, although it is anything but silent and absolutely tangible. Yet, through length and repetition, it became an almost phantom conflict. There were no bodies, just coffins, and images were carefully screened by the Pentagon and other authorities, especially under the Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld regime. Unlike the Vietnam War, which wound up in everybody's home on nightly television, whether they liked it or not, and which polarized the nation precisely because of its visibility, the war in Iraq has largely been fought undercover, and the most recent iterations of it as cinematic constructs, such as The Hurt Locker, bear the burden of years of misdirection and misrepresentation in the media. Television has become an avalanche of shopping channels and, quote, reality programs, coupled with an embrace of nostalgia for a time that is now almost beyond authentic recall. In short, the arts after 9/11 embraced loss, death, corporate ethos, and the reification of violence in a Roman wilderness of pain. The 2010 film Essential Killing by Jerzy Skolimowski, which is a brilliant film, and if you haven't seen it, I absolutely urge you to see it. When he premiered it at Cannes, he said, "For those who like me, I'm back. For those who don't like me, I'm back." He took 15 years off in between. Which depicts the escape of a rendered captive in Eastern Europe, offers further proof of our current economy of images. Shot for a pittance with only one leading character, portrayed by Vincent Gallo, who never speaks during the entire film, we see the war machine does what the war machine does to all sides, to all combatants. It's the great dehumanizer, the leveler of all values, past and present. That we even consider, as a society, the use of waterboarding as a legitimate interrogation technique doesn't go down all that well even at Fox News, or one of the television's most visible hosts, Shepard Smith, when confronted with undeniable fact of the practice, was seemingly unable to contain his outrage. "We are America," he shouted. "I don't give a rat's ass if it helps. We are America. We do not fucking torture. We just don't do it," on live television. Surprisingly, he wasn't fired, and the clip immediately went viral on YouTube. And yet in shows like 24 and other post-9/11 entertainments, torture of one kind or another is part of the regular diet. The execution of Muammar Gaddafi, who clearly deserved whatever fate he had in store with him, is nevertheless another example of 21st century visual entertainment. Graphic video clips of his execution and that of Saddam Hussein have gotten millions of hits on the webs. Clearly, as a society, we do torture, and we love to do it. It offers, for those too inarticulate to express it otherwise, some fleeting relief from our own pain. If one looks at our shared cinematic past, we can see that we've always been playing with disaster, fascinated by destruction. The 2,823 victims of the September 11th disaster, just in the Twin Towers, not counting the victims in the two planes that struck the World Trade Center or in the people around, plus the 16 acres of damage at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, are merely the fulfillment of a dream of annihilation that has fascinated us for centuries. It is only in the latter part of the 19th century, and the 20th century, and now the 21st century, that we can give these phantasmal visions faces and sounds of a concrete actuality. The regime of CGI, computer-generated imagery effects, has made this illusion even more seamless. Where once matte lines and other technical imperfections in film created limit zones of virtual reality, or visual reality, that distanced us from the spectacle we witnessed, now CGI makes a tidal wave, an atomic blast, a hurricane, or meteor impact seem as real as late afternoon sunlight spilling through a back porch window. There is no separation anymore, no zone of the real and the not real. The cinema of the 21st century makes our most violent dreams of self-destruction simultaneously mundane and yet instantly attainable. In the post-9/11 world, the romance of Armageddon is being replaced by the spectacle of inevitable destruction, albeit on a smaller scale. Piece by piece, city by city, landmark by landmark. The delicate balance of post-World War II nuclear politics has given way to a new war in which atomic bombs capable of decimating an entire metropolis in just one blast can fit in a suitcase. The global apocalypse depicted by Stanley Kubrick in 1964's Dr. Strangelove now seems simultaneously remote, almost nostalgic, and yet infinitely more tangible. The 21st century will be defined not by wars, but by terrorist incursions. The current U.S. administration, and actually this is the Bush administration, seemed intent on upping the ante with each new pronouncement, even as tension spots in India, Pakistan, the Middle East, Africa, and Northern Ireland continue to simmer even after decades of conflict. In a speech at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in June 2006, George W. Bush declared that, quote, preemptive military strikes may be necessary to confront the worst threats before they emerge, unquote, thereby creating a scenario in which attack becomes defense. This policy of perpetual alarmism creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, just as violent action thrillers in video games inspire those who become addicted to them and take the games to the next step. Real victims, real weapons. Even a casual glance at the social landscape of contemporary America reveals that we've become a nation marked by outbursts of senseless violence. One example is a series of random shootings at U.S. colleges and universities, such as the event at Northern Illinois University on St. Valentine's Day in 2008, in which 5 students were killed and several more injured before the gunman committed suicide at the scene of the crime. The culture of guns, of death, of kill or be killed must inevitably lead to violence. Is that not its message? Thus, in a post-9/11 cinematic landscape with such films and television shows as 24, Collateral Damage, The Sum of All Fears, United Flight 93, The Path to 9/11, the aforementioned Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, the Saw films, Hostel 1, 2, and 3, and numerous other exemplars, we must fight to find a path toward an understanding of the new cinematic landscape in which violence and catastrophe are viewed as everyday constants. Some of the films that are being produced today seek to reassure us. Others to make us feel that no matter how violent the carnage on screen, we are safe from harm. We can witness this, but yet we survive. In the face of such an unimaginable disaster as 9/11, those who witnessed the actual event often said that it seemed just like a movie, because it was so immediate, so uncontainable, so brutally violent. And thus we as a society have become simultaneously sentimental and violent, longing for a more secure past when nuclear weapons weren't so accessible, or better yet, didn't even exist, while at the same time confronting the present with an uneasy mix of belligerence and incomprehension. Many of the post-9/11 films deal with the concept of brutal violent torture directly, and the genre of torture porn, or extreme filmmaking, has sprung up, I would argue, and also David Edelstein of New York Magazine has argued, as a response to the events of 9/11. Hostel 3 in particular deals directly with torture as television entertainment, focusing on a group of frat boy high rollers in Las Vegas who are summarily kidnapped while gambling in a casino. The film offers the viewer the spectacle of these unfortunate victims being graphically tortured in a televised game entitled, and this is not a joke, Wheel of Misfortune. As multi-millionaires sit luxuriously in chairs and are served drinks by submissive waitresses, the kidnapped victims are brutally chopped, sawed, knifed, gouged, shot with arrows, eviscerated for their, and by implication, our entertainment. How long do you think it will take for him to die, says one spectator as he reaches for a dry martini. That this film even exists is almost a crime against humanity. Along with Human Centipede 1 and 2, which offer the viewer the spectacle of a group of human beings being sewn together in one extended body, forced to eat each other's excrement as part of their shared food chain, and the equally repellent Serbian film, which features graphic scenes depicting the rape of a newborn infant, it seems that all representational bounds of film have collapsed, and that anything, literally anything, is fair game. Most of these films have gotten an R rating from the MPAA, which still rates any films depicting consensual sex or nudity with a flat NC-17, equivalent to an X rating, while scenes of brutal violence continually get a pass. In this, we're almost unique as a culture. In Europe, it's the violence that's censored. Here, it's celebrated. We're much more comfortable with torture, war, and violence than with lovemaking as a culture, something that's also evidenced in the equally violent video games that now dominate the market. At the same time, saccharine entertainment such as The War Horse and Hugo represent the other end of the spectrum. Feel-good films in which everything turns out right at the end because nothing was at risk in the first place. Teens dream of vampiric immortality in the Twilight series. For the boys, it offers the perpetual adolescence of being undead. For girls, the dream of romance without losing one's virginity. A vision of stasis on all fronts. War Horse follows the adventures of Joey, a World War I draft horse caught up in the conflict, but presented in such a sentimentalized fashion that knowledgeable critics, such as Jim Hoberman in The Village Voice in a review posted on December 21st, 2011, cringed at the results, saying, quote, Spielberg seeks to represent the horror of modern combat in human or at least mammalian terms. But since he's a director largely incapable of understatement, War Horse is served up with a series of self-aggrandizing, distracting surplus of Norman Rockwell backlighting, aerial landscapes shots designed to outswoop David Lean's, and an aggravated sense of doggone wonderment, amplified by the director's dependence on John Williams' bombastic score. Dialogue is superfluous. In its way, War Horse is as much as a silent movie as the artist. Every triumph is pounded into your head and punctuated by a Dali-in close-up. I'd also like to parenthetically say that that was one of the last reviews that Jim Hoberman wrote for The Village Voice, and this is not a joke. He was fired shortly thereafter. Jim Hoberman is one of the nation's greatest critics. He worked at The Village Voice for more than 30 years. He was intelligent, sharp, and smart. And in this review, when I read it, I thought to myself, and I'm not quoting it here in its entirety, when I read it, I thought to myself, this is absolutely brutal evisceration. And I was really, amazed that he was going to go, and it gets much worse. I mean, it winds up being a personal attack almost, saying, is there any catastrophe that hasn't been Spielbergized? And then it just goes into a long attack on all of his other films. And 3 days later, he was fired, basically because he was not conforming to what the mainstream media wanted him to say. The same thing happened many years ago with a critic named Renata Adler, who was writing at the New York Times. And she was fired because she just didn't like enough movies, So basically, one of the most compromised critical art forms now, basically because of the pervasiveness of the web and things like Ain't It Cool and the various different other fanboy websites and things like that, honest criticism or intelligent, informed criticism has gone out the window because the print medium is so flimsy, it just depends so much on the financial resources. Just as a final note before I go back to the paper, recently the New York Times had to borrow $50 million just to keep going, all right? And no bank would loan it to them, all right? The New York Times had to go to Carlos Slim, who is a rather shady Mexican billionaire, and borrow $50 million from him at 10% interest per year, just to keep going. So with the New York Times being on the ropes in such a manner, right, what hope do we have of any kind of honest criticism? I mean, people who say Roger Ebert, I'm sorry, he went over to the other side a long time ago. And Peter Travers at Rolling Stone, blurb him out. Anyway, it hopefully goes without saying that none of these visions of the world is realistic, but this is what multiplexes now offer. Horror almost beyond imagination,
or escapism without a shred of credibility. It's an entirely new world we live in after 9/11. The stage's representation has been irrevocably altered. The world around us is now a dangerous place. How will we view and be affected by these new scenarios of imminent destruction? Television news continually presents us with the possibility, often enhanced by computer graphics, of a nuclear holocaust. Yet the idea of nuclear terrorism is hardly new. E.B. White, in his 1949 study, Here is New York, after celebrating the city's multicultural heritage and magnificent urban sprawl, sounded this note of warning. The city, for the first time in its long history, is destructible. A single flight of planes no bigger than a wedge of geese can quickly end this silent fantasy, burn the towers, crumble the bridges, turn the underground passages to lethal chambers, cremate the millions. The intonation of mortality is part of New York now, in the sound of jets overhead and the black headlines of the latest edition. Of all targets, New York has a certain clear priority. In the mind of whatever perverted dreamer might loose the lightning, New York must hold a steady, irresistible charm. This is 1949. All right? Thus, long before the prophets of disaster turned Armageddon into a pop culture pastime, the author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little had a precise fix on precisely what makes Manhattan so alluring, its vulnerability. Today, such a scenario would be even easier. One suitcase left in the right location would spell the end of centuries of cultural work and the lives of millions of people. Is it no wonder that this nightmarish vision haunts us and continues to play out in the popular media with ever-increasing frequency? For it seems that the day White prophesied is coming closer all the time. Thus we live in fear. Fear that can be marketed, packaged, and sold. The film Children of Men posits the reality of just such a future, and perhaps that's the reason why this prescient film was a relative failure at the box office. England soldiers on, as the posters within the film put it, as the rest of the world collapses into poverty and violence, a world in which human birth is, for reasons that are never explained, no longer possible. Perhaps the planet has decided that enough is enough, so to speak, and given up on humankind. But whatever the cause, pregnancy is impossible. Schools and universities are abandoned. Who needs them when the old person is now 18 and no one else is coming along to repopulate the species? Not only is Children of Men resolutely dystopian, envisioning a future in which rich or poor are utterly stratified, it also examines the racism, violence, and paramilitary extremism that necessarily arrive from such a police state. This atmosphere of all-consuming terror thus opens up a host of opportunities for new products that may protect us from terrorist attacks, or then again, they may not. In the early stages of the 2008 campaign, the politician and actor Fred Dalton Thompson, best known for his continuing role in the TV series Law and Order, was running for the office of President of the United States. In Ben Goddard's film Last Best Chance, 2005, he had already attained that office and is saddled with the unenviable task of preventing nuclear terrorism in the U.S., working with a system so porous that failure is almost inevitable. Surrounded by a group of advisors who seem overwhelmed by their task, the fictional president, portrayed by Thompson, one Charles B. Ross, fights to sift through an avalanche of conflicting reports, chatter on the internet, and interdepartmental intrigues because, as he puts it, I don't want us sitting on our butts if something's about to happen. But in the end, despite cooperation from the Russian government, a prospect that seems increasingly remote these days, all his vigilance is to no avail. Through a complex web of international negotiations, a group of terrorists managed to assemble a nuclear device in Canada and then smuggle it across the border in an isolated location, right under the notices of customs officials. At the same time, bombs are being smuggled in from other locations, and President Ross dolefully admits to his staff that, quote, I don't know how many there are, where they are, or what I can do to stop them. The film ends with the implication that one or more of the devices will soon be detonated on U.S. soil. Reality television routinely traffics in humility and degradation, self-inflicted or otherwise, while the scenarios of shows like 24 Years have visually depicted the world continuing on the precipice of destruction. Microsoft's film Flight Simulator video game, for example, allows its pilots to pilot virtual jet planes through the skies of the United States, and if they so desire, to crash into various landmarks as they land. When Kabul fell to Allied forces, Western journalists noted that among the items strewn about in the wreckage of the Al-Qaeda safe houses were instructions on how to play the flight simulator game. When Peter Watkins directed the classic docudrama The War Game in 1965, depicting what would really happen in the event of an all-out nuclear attack of Great Britain, the BBC refused to run it, asserting that it would disturb their viewers. Though not a single sequence in the film is authentic, obviously because it's about World War III, the 47-minute featurette won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1967, a tribute to its gritty cinema verite appearance. In Watkins' film, which set the standard for numerous depictions of nuclear conflict that would follow, the bomb kills millions immediately, sets houses on fire, and sentences the rest of the population to a lingering death from radiation poisoning. In stark contrast to the preparedness films in the 1950s, Watkins demonstrates that no matter what precautions one takes, the loss of life will be enormous, governments will collapse, cities will crumble, and civilization as we conceive of it will cease to exist. If anything, the current appetite for corporeal and spiritual destruction is nothing more than a manifestation of manic information overload. We now have access to everything, but the sheer quantity of information overwhelms us. Yet all of it remains remote somehow, carefully contained within a box of homicidal and genocidal dreams. In the middle of Jason X, which is one of the Jason films, two of the film's characters play a video game in which they create an alternate universe and then proceed to hack each other to pieces with graphic verisimilitude. When Jason unexpectedly enters the game world, they both shout, "Game over," at which point everything in the synthetic playground vanishes except for Jason himself. As Jason lumbers towards his two victims, the players cry, "Pause, pause," expecting Jason to freeze in his tracks. But Jason, of course, is not part of the game. He is, within the construct of the film's narrative, real. And thus both players meet actual death as Jason wordlessly dispatches one end and the other. Yet all of this moves us not at all because we know that we are playing a game. Because we can hit the pause button on the movie at any time or exit the theater without fear of reprisal. What happens to us when part of ourselves dies? What happens when the world dies? At what point is annihilation so total that there is no possibility of repair, no hope of rehabilitation, no possible way to recover what has been lost? When we view images in the darkness that prefigure our own end, we are trying to visualize our perfect death, to choreograph the end of time to our own personal advantage. When we cease to exist, the world ceases to exist for us because we can no longer apprehend it. And it is this moment that we fear and anticipate above all others because it represents the complete disintegration of the self. The visions offered by the arts after 9/11, then, are but a part of the stakes of the new cinematic representation. As we enter the era of holographic computer games in which we can die and die again, painlessly in a variety of aesthetically pleasing ways, we must ask ourselves, what are we afraid of? Why do we seek disaster? Why are we so eager for the end? The answer is simple. When we dream of the certainty and the inevitability of the apocalypse, we dream of our fear of life itself. Thank you very much.